John Carter had spent the last 10 months in a place where the sound of gunfire and the hum of helicopters were the only constants. Every dawn was met with the sharp crack of orders, the weight of his gear, and the ever-present tension that came with being a soldier in a war zone. He had never been the type to count the days until his return. Deployment had a way of stripping a man of the illusion of control, but this time was different. For months, he had thought of nothing else but the moment he would set foot on his own porch again, drop his duffel bag by the door, and let the silence of his house settle around him like a well-worn jacket. John wasn't returning to a wife or kids. He wasn't coming home to the smell of a favorite meal waiting for him. No, his homecoming would be simpler than that, just him, his house, and the deep, bone-deep relief of knowing he was finally back where he belonged. It had taken him years to buy that housey, modest two-story property in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't luxurious, but it had a kind of understated solidity that made it feel permanent. It wasn't just a piece of real estate. It was the one thing he had built for himself after years of temporary housing, overseas stations, and feeling like his life existed in a transient state. When he first bought it, people told him it was too much space for one man, that it was the kind of house meant for a family, not a single soldier who spent half his life on the move. But John had never seen it that way. The house was a choice, a statement that no matter where he was sent, no matter how long he was gone, there would always be a place waiting for him, a place that was his. That thought stayed with him on the drive home, the city gradually fading behind him as he entered the quieter streets of his neighborhood. The familiar roads brought an almost unconscious sense of ease. He knew every turn, every landmark. As he got closer, he felt a flicker of anticipation in his chest, a rare thing for a man who had spent most of his adult life keeping emotions locked behind steel doors. He imagined the moment he would step inside, the feel of the doorknob under his palm, the scent of old wood and faint traces of gun oil lingering in the air from the last time he cleaned his rifle before deployment. Maybe he'd pour himself a drink, sit on the worn-out couch in the living room, and let himself relax for the first time in what felt like years. But as he turned onto his street, something felt wrong. At first, it was subtle, the way the lawn in front of his house looked different. Not overgrown, not neglected, but unfamiliar. Someone had planted something along the walkway, small shrubs that hadn't been there before. Then, as he pulled closer, his grip on the steering wheel tightened. The curtains were different, a different color, a different fabric. He blinked, his mind struggling to process the details that didn't fit. And then he saw a car in the driveway. Not his. The sight of it hit him harder than a gunshot. His mind immediately went to the worst-case scenario. Had the house been broken into? But no, that didn't make sense. The car was parked neatly, as if it belonged there. And there was movement inside. Someone was home. John killed the engine and stepped out, his boots hitting the pavement with a weight that felt heavier than it should have. His heartbeat was steady, but his muscles were tense, a lifetime of training making his body react before his mind could fully catch up. He didn't march up to the door, didn't start banging on it like some unhinged lunatic. Instead, he took a slow breath, squared his shoulders, and walked with purpose. The door opened before he even reached it. A man stood there, mid-40s, balding, wearing a wrinkled t-shirt and cargo shorts, the kind of outfit that suggested complete ownership of the space he stood in. His eyes flickered with mild confusion, then settled into something closer to annoyance. "Can I help you?" the man asked. John stared at him for a second, every fiber of his being screaming that this was wrong. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. The man furrowed his brows. "I live here." "Who the hell are you?" The air shifted. A cold, sinking weight settled in John's stomach. He took a slow step forward, forcing his voice to stay even. "This is my house." The man exhaled sharply, as if he had expected something else, some casual conversation about the weather. Instead of answering, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a set of keys. He jingled them onto a lazy, almost dismissive gesture. "No, it's mine." John's pulse slammed in his ears. "The hell it is." The man stepped onto the porch, not aggressively, but with the kind of confidence that came from knowing you were in the right. He pulled out his phone, tapped the screen a few times, then held it up. "I bought it legally." "Here, look." John didn't take the phone. His eyes locked onto the document on the screen, scanning the words without fully registering them. "Sale agreement. Transfer of ownership." The numbers hit him like a fist to the gut. $1,550. His house. The home he had spent years paying off, the place that had been waiting for him while he served his country, had been sold for less than the price of a used laptop. For the first time in his life, John felt like the ground beneath him had disappeared. He had been in life-threatening situations, had stared down the barrel of a gun more times than he could count. But this was different. This wasn't the kind of battle he knew how to fight. The man in front of him was still talking, something about an auction, unpaid fees, a legal foreclosure. John barely heard him. The words blurred together, meaningless noise in the wake of the simple, undeniable truth had been erased. Everything he had worked for, everything he had built, was gone, and someone had made sure of it. John stood there, his body rigid, his mind racing, yet his face remained unreadable. It was an instinct drilled into him over years of Ser vy Senever, let them see your reaction, never give away your next move. But beneath that carefully controlled exterior, a storm was brewing. His home, the one thing that had grounded him through the chaos of deployments, through the endless nights in foreign places where safety was just an illusion, had been stripped away in his absence. The man standing in the doorway wasn't a thief in the traditional sense, but John didn't need a weapon in his hand to recognize an enemy when he saw one. He didn't lunge, didn't demand answers right then and there, because there was no point. The man wasn't the mastermind behind this. He was just the last piece in a carefully constructed scheme, one that had clearly been set in motion long before John had even boarded the plane home. He forced himself to take a slow breath, let the rage coil inside him instead of exploding outward. Who sold it to you? His voice came out level, though he could feel the weight behind it, an unspoken warning simmering beneath the surface. The man whose name he hadn't even bothered to ask gave a half shrug. Got it through the neighborhood association's auction. Everything was done legally. He said it like that was supposed to mean something, as if it erased the blatant theft that had occurred. He leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms, his stance shifting into one of mild irritation. Look, man, I don't know what to tell you. You're saying this was your house? Fine. But I bought it fair and square, and I'm not about to just hand it over because you showed up on my porch. John ignored the heat rising in his chest, the sharp pulse in his jaw as he clenched it tighter. He didn't need to argue with this man. He needed answers, and not from someone who had just been handed the keys to his life for pennies on the dollar. Who was in charge of the auction? The man squinted slightly, as if debating whether to humor him or slam the door in his face. After a moment, he sighed. Some woman runs the association. I guess. Nicole Spencer, I think. That name didn't mean anything to him. He had never dealt with her, never had a reason to. He had never even signed up to be a part of the neighborhood association. Why would he? He had bought the house outright, no shared amenities, no common areas, nothing that required their oversight. But somehow, in the months he had been gone, they had found a way to claim ownership over something that had never belonged to them in the first place. He didn't waste another second standing there. Without a word, he turned on his heel and walked away, back to his truck. He could feel the man watching him, could almost hear the unspoken relief in the way the door shut behind him, like he had just avoided a confrontation he wasn't equipped to handle. John slid into the driver's seat, gripped the steering wheel, and forced himself to think. His first instinct was to go straight to whoever this Nicole Spencer was and demand answers, but years of dealing with bureaucracy told him that wouldn't get him anywhere. No, if they had the audacity to pull something like this, then they would have their defenses already prepared. They would have a wall of paperwork, a string of legal jargon, and just enough plausible deniability to make it look like they had done everything by the book. So he did what any rational man would do in a situation like Tishy, called a lawyer. It took less than 20 minutes to get an appointment with Brian Martinez, a former JAG officer who had transitioned into CIVY in practice. John had heard about him through mutual connections and knew that if there was anyone who could untangle the legal mess he had just been thrown into, it was him. He drove straight to Martinez's office, parking outside a modest building that lacked the polished corporate sterility of high-end law firms. This wasn't a place for vanity cases or drawn-out litigation for the sake of billable hours. This was where you went when you needed a problem solved. Inside, Martinez was already waiting for him, a man in his early 40s with sharp eyes and the kind of presence that commanded a room without needing to raise his voice. He shook John's hand firmly, gestured for him to sit, and wasted no time getting to the point. Tell me everything. John laid it all out: the deployment, the house, the so-called auction, the absurd sale price that couldn't have covered a month's rent in most places, let alone the full value of the property. Martinez listened without interruption, only nodding occasionally, his expression unreadable as he jotted down notes. When John finished, there was a long moment of silence as the lawyer processed the information, flipping through a legal pad with the precision of someone who was already constructing a plan in his head. Then he set the pen down and looked John directly in the eye. This isn't just a clerical error. They knew exactly what they were doing. John already knew that, but hearing it from someone who dealt with these kinds of cases daily made it all the more real. Martinez continued, his tone measured. First thing we do is pull every document related to that sale. If they filed foreclosure, we'll see when and how. If they issued a lien, we'll find out on what grounds. But here's the thing: you say you never signed up for the association, right? John nodded. Martinez exhaled sharply. Then they had no legal right to place your home under their jurisdiction. Which means one of two things: either they falsified documents, or they exploited a loophole. John already felt the heat rising in his chest again. And if they faked something? A flicker of something sharp crossed Martinez's face. Then they committed fraud. And that's a whole different level of legal trouble. He leaned back in his chair, tapping a finger against the desk. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. I'll have the county clerk pull all property records related to your address. In the meantime, you don't engage with them directly. No threats, no confrontations. You let me handle it. John forced himself to nod, though every fiber of his being was itching to go straight to Spencer's office and demand answers. Martinez studied him for a moment before adding, and one more thing: if they went through this much trouble to make your house disappear, they're going to push back hard when they realize you're not rolling over. You be ready for that. John didn't need to be told twice. He had been fighting his whole life, and he sure as hell wasn't about to stop now. He stood, shook Martinez's hand, and walked out of the office with only one thought in his mind: whoever had taken his home thought he was just another faceless soldier, too far away to fight back. They were about to learn how very wrong they were. John left Martinez's office with a plan, but no amount of preparation could stop the rising anger clawing at his chest. He had expected some kind of bureaucratic hurdle: mistakes on paperwork, maybe an unnoticed technicality that could be overturned. But this was deliberate. Someone had made sure that his home was taken from him, that by the time he returned, it would be too late to fight back. It wasn't incompetency, it was a calculated move. And the more he thought about it, the clearer it became that whoever was behind it had done this before. That thought alone made his jaw clench. How many others had come home to find their lives wiped away like an afterthought? How many of them had walked into a legal brick wall, drowning in paperwork and fine print, while someone else profited from their absence? He wasn't naive enough to think he was the first, and that realization made his next steps even more crucial. He wasn't just fighting for his house, was about to rip open something much bigger. The next morning, Martinez called with the first wave of information. The foreclosure had been pushed through on the basis of unpaid association fees, except John had never been a member. The property records showed that his house had been reclassified under their jurisdiction less than a month after he deployed. The change was filed under an amendment to the neighborhood agreement that had supposedly been signed by every homeowner in the area. His name was on that document, his signature clear as day, except he had never signed it. Martinez didn't sound surprised when John pointed that out. It's not the first time I've seen this. They file amendments, send out notices, and if no one contests them in time, they slide it through. Then they backdate signatures so it looks like everyone agreed. They count on people not paying attention or, in your case, not being around to fight it. John pressed his fingers against his temple, trying to push back the pounding frustration. So what do? First, we need the original copy of that amendment. If they forged your signature, we'll have proof. I've already filed the request for it, but don't expect them to hand it over easily. John didn't expect anything from them except more lies. He had dealt with corruption before, had seen firsthand how people in power bent the rules in their favor. This wasn't a mistake, it was a scheme, which meant they would fight like hell to keep it quiet. A few hours later, he drove past his house again. The new owner was outside, standing in the driveway with a clipboard in one hand and a cigarette in the other. A MOVYing truck was parked nearby, a couple of workers unloading furniture. For a brief second, John's fingers twitched on the steering wheel. He could stop, walk up there, force the man to look him in the eye while explaining how he thought he had the right to be in that house. But that wouldn't get him anywhere. He wasn't about to give them an excuse to paint him as unstable or violent. Instead, he drove straight to the office of the neighborhood association. The building was exactly what he expected: small, well-kept, designed to look more like a community center than a business. Inside, a receptionist barely glanced up from her computer when he walked in. "Can I help you?" "I need to speak to Nicole Spencer." She finally looked up, giving him a polite but unimpressed once-over. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but tell her it's about 147 Elmwood." Something flickered in her expression, not surprise, more like recognition. That told him enough. This wasn't just another property dispute for them. They already knew exactly who he was. "I'll check if she's available," she said, typing something on her screen before disappearing through a door in the back. John didn't sit. He stood in the center of the room, hands in his pockets, staring at the motivational posters on the walls about community spirit and neighborhood unity. What a joke. The door opened, and a woman stepped out, late 40s, blonde hair, and a professional cut, the kind of tailored blazer that people wore when they wanted to project competence. She looked him over with a perfectly rehearsed smile, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Carter, I was wondering when you might stop by." She extended a hand. He didn't take it. Her smile didn't falter. "Well, come on in, then." He followed her into a small conference room, the kind meant for board meetings and quiet settlements. The walls were lined with neatly arranged binders, documents probably filled with the same kind of legal manipulation that had stolen his house. She gestured for him to sit. He didn't. So she sat, folding her hands neatly on the table. "I assume this is about your former property." He ignored the way she said "former property," like it was already decided. "I never agreed to be a part of your association." She sighed, tilting her head slightly. "I understand that this is frustrating, but when the amendment was passed, every homeowner in the area became subject to new regulations. Your name was on that agreement." "No, it wasn't." Her smile didn't shift, but there was something colder behind it now. "We have it on file." John leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the back of one of the chairs. "Then let me see it." There was a pause, just a fraction too long, then she gave another soft, almost pitying sigh. "Unfortunately, we can't release those documents without a formal legal request. But I assure you, everything was done correctly." John stared at her, and for the first time since walking in, he saw the slight tension in her shoulders, the way she was carefully choosing every word. She wasn't just brushing him off, she was stalling. Martinez had been right. They weren't going to give him anything willingly. He pushed off the chair, straightening. "Then I guess I'll have to get the courts involved." Her smile was polite, dismissive, but as he turned to leave, her voice stopped him. "I do hope you reconsider, Mr. Carter." He glanced back. She was still sitting there, perfectly composed, but there was something sharper in her expression, now less accommodating. "You served, didn't you?" she continued. "I read that in the paperwork. And I imagine you've seen your fair share of fights. But some battles aren't worth the cost." John didn't move, didn't let his face betray a single reaction. She folded her hands again. "I'd hate for this to drag on longer than necessary for your sake." There it was. The threat was subtle, buried beneath layers of corporate civility, but he had spent enough years deciphering power plays to recognize one when he heard it. He gave her a slow, steady nod. "So would I." Then he walked out. As soon as he stepped into the parking lot, his phone buzzed. It was Martinez. "They refused to send the documents," John said as soon as he answered. "I know," Martinez said, "because I just got a call from their lawyer. They're filing a motion to dismiss your case." John's grip tightened around the phone. They were trying to shut him down before he even got started. But they had just made their first mistake, because now he wasn't just fighting to get his house back. He was going to make sure every single person involved paid for what they had done. John sat in his truck outside the office, his fingers gripping the steering wheel as he let Spencer's words replay in his head. There was something about the way she had spoken to him, the casual arrogance of it all, the polished delivery of a threat disguised as concern. She hadn't told him to back off outright, but she had made it clear that she expected him to. That meant one thing: this wasn't just some small-time scam. Some routine paperwork trickery that would resolve itself with the right legal intervention. They had pushed him out because they believed he wouldn't have the means to fight back. That was their mistake. His phone buzzed again. Martinez. They're trying to kill the case before it even gets to court, Martinez said. Filing on the grounds that the foreclosure was conducted legally and that your challenge is invalid because the property has already changed hands. John exhaled slowly. And they're stalling trying to tie this up in legal motions for as long as possible, hoping I'll either run out of money or patience. Martinez didn't respond immediately, but John could almost hear the lawyer's mind working. What's our next move? I'm pulling in every contact I have at the county clerk's office. I want to see the full chain of documents from the moment they put that amendment in place to the minute they sold your house. But that takes time. And we need leverage now. John ran a hand over his face, grounding himself. Then we get something they can't bury in paperwork. There was a pause before Martinez spoke again, his voice edged with something sharper. I was hoping you'd say that. By the time John arrived at the county records office, Martinez was already inside, waiting with a file in his hands. He looked up as John approached, his expression unreadable. We have a problem, Martinez said. John stiffened. Bigger than the ones we already knew about. Martinez handed him the file. They didn't just reclassify your house. They classified the entire block. Every single property was folded into their jurisdiction within the same 2-month window. John flipped through the pages, his pulse ticking higher with each line he read. Names of homeowners, signatures that all looked just a little too uniform, dates that conveniently lined up with periods when people were either out of town or, like him, unable to respond. This wasn't random, he muttered. No, Martinez said. And it gets worse. I checked court records from the past 5 years. This association has filed foreclosures on at least 12 other properties, all with the same pattern. Sudden reclassification, backdated fees, quick auctions to shell companies. John's grip tightened on the paper. And nobody stopped them? Some tried, Martinez said. 3 lawsuits were filed. 2 got dismissed. The third dragged on for nearly 2 years before the homeowner settled moved out. John's stomach twisted. Settled? Martinez's gaze darkened. The house burned down a week before the trial was set to begin. Official cause was faulty wiring. No investigation was opened. John closed the file, his mind running through every scenario, every possibility. This was bigger than his house. It was a business, a well-oiled machine that had been running under the radar for years. And now, they had made him their latest target. The next step was clear. If the legal route was going to take time, then he needed to start pressuring them in ways they couldn't control. He needed to start making them nervous. That evening, he drove back to his old street, parking a few houses down and killing the engine. The house looked different in the dimming light, like a stranger wearing something that didn't quite fit. The new owner wasn't outside this time, but the lights were on, someone was home. John watched for a while, waiting, observing. He wasn't expecting a revelation to fall into his lap, but he needed to see anything that would tell him more about who was benefiting from this scam. Then, as if on cue, a car pulled up to the curb. Not the battered sedan of the man who had claimed to own the house. This was something different. A black SUV, windows tinted too dark to see through, rolled to a smooth stop in front of the driveway. John sat up, eyes narrowing as the driver's door opened. Nicole Spencer stepped out. She didn't knock. She didn't hesitate. She walked straight into the house as if she owned it. John exhaled slowly, every instinct sharpening. She wasn't just handling this on a professional level, she was personally involved. That meant she had something to lose. He waited, watching the minutes tick, biting, 20. Then, finally, she reappeared, stepping back outside and making a call before getting into her SUV. The vehicle disappeared down the street, leaving John staring after it, the weight of the moment settling into his bones. He had just found his opening. The next day, Martinez sent him an update. I got a judge to approve a motion to unseal financial records tied to these transactions. It's not a full subpoena, but it's a start. John nodded. And if we don't find anything? Martinez's mouth pressed into a thin line. Then we keep digging until we do. That night, John waited again. This time, when the black SUV returned, he was ready. He didn't approach. He didn't make a move. He just watched because Spencer had made a mistake coming back here twice in a row. She was trying to control something, to keep it from slipping through her fingers, which meant she was afraid. And that meant he was getting closer. John had been in fights before, real ones, the kind where hesitation meant someone didn't go home. He knew what it felt like to be up against something bigger than himself, knew the weight of facing an enemy who had every advantage. This wasn't a battlefield, but the rules weren't all that different. He had spent years navigating hostile territory, and if this situation had taught him anything, it was that a war didn't always announce itself with gunfire. Sometimes, it came in the form of paperwork and signatures, in threats disguised as legal notices, in the slow erosion of everything a man thought was his. But if Nicole Spencer and her people thought they could wear him down, they had miscalculated. He had spent the last few days tracking her movements, mapping out the way she handled this mess she had created. She had power, but power made people sloppy. She had returned to his house more than once, had held private meetings with the so-called owner. She had moved like someone trying to keep a lid on something that was close to boiling over. That told him everything he needed to know. She wasn't as in control as she wanted to be. And that meant it was time to push back. Martinez had been working every angle, trying to find the loose thread that would unravel this entire operation. He had gotten financial records unsealed, had tracked transactions that shouldn't have existed, had found just enough inconsistencies to prove that this wasn't just about one house site, was about a pattern. But patterns weren't enough to win a fight like this. They needed something undeniable, something that couldn't be brushed off as coincidence or clerical error. So John went looking. It started with the people in the neighborhood, the ones who had been there long enough to see things shift, to watch homes change hands under circumstances that didn't always make sense. Most of them weren't eager to talk, but some were a retired couple down the street, a woman who had nearly lost her own home but had somehow managed to settle at the last minute, a man whose brother had left town after his foreclosure, never bothering to fight it. The same names came up over and over again: Spencer, the real estate firms that kept ending up with these properties, the same handful of buyers who seemed to be involved in every transaction. It wasn't just a scam, it was an industry. Then, late one night, Martinez called. His voice was different this time, sharper, more urgent. "I found something." John was already grabbing his keys. "Where?" "Meet me at my office." He drove fast, his mind already racing ahead of him, piecing together possibilities before he even knew what Martinez had found. When he walked into the office, the lawyer was waiting, a thick folder sitting open on his desk. Martinez pushed it toward him. "You're going to want to see this." John sat down, scanning the documents: bank transfers, corporate records, payments made to Spencer's firm from a source that shouldn't have existed. He frowned. "What am I looking at?" Martinez leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his face. "A shell company. One that technically doesn't exist, but someone's been using it to move money, large amounts of it. And not just for your house. This goes back years." John flipped through the pages, his mind narrowing in on the details. "How sure are we?" Martinez exhaled. "Sure enough." John nodded slowly. "Then let's make them nervous." He wasn't stupid. He knew walking into Spencer's office and throwing this in her face wouldn't get him what he wanted. She would deny it, call her lawyers, find a way to spin it. He needed to force her into a position where she couldn't maneuver her way out. So he did something she wouldn't expect. He waited. 2 nights later, she came back to his house again, another meeting, another quiet conversation behind closed doors. John was parked 2 blocks away, watching. He waited until she was inside, waited until the SUV that had brought her drove off. Then he moved. The back door was still the same. He knew it well enough to know how it had been changed, but not enough to stop him. He had learned how to enter buildings long before this, had been trained for situations where getting in and out unnoticed wasn't just useful, it was necessary. He stepped inside, the air thick with the smell of fresh paint and new furniture. The house was different now, but beneath the changes, it was still his. And now, so was the conversation happening in the next room. He stayed in the shadows, listening. "She's panicking," a voice sighed, a man. "The new owner. The whole thing's blowing up." Spencer's voice was calmer. "No, it's not." There was a pause. Then, "They're looking into the records. Someone's talking." John could almost hear the shift in her expression. "Who?" "I don't know." A sharp exhale. "But if we don't shut it down, we will." Spencer's voice was steady, but there was an edge beneath it now. "Don't lose your nerve." Another pause. Then, softer, "What about Carter?" John felt his jaw tighten. Spencer's voice dropped. He'll either walk away, or he won't. A silence stretched. Then the man said, and if he doesn't? A beat. Then Spencer said, then we make sure he does. John stayed long enough to hear the rest, long enough to understand exactly how deep this went. Then he left. By the time he met Martinez again, his mind was set. They're going to try and shut this down, he said, pacing the lawyer's office. They know we're close. Martinez watched him, his expression unreadable. Then we move first. John stopped. What do you have in mind? Martinez's mouth pressed into a thin line. We go public. We take everything we have, everything they don't want getting out, and we put it in front of a judge before they have a chance to bury it. John nodded. It wasn't the only move, but it was the right one. And if Spencer and her people thought they could make him walk away, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. John had spent enough time in combat zones to know what it felt like when the air changed, when pressure built to the point where something had to break. This wasn't a battlefield, but the tension was the same. He could feel it in the way Spencer had started moving differently, in the way her people were scrambling to put out fires before they got too big to control. He had spent weeks watching them play defense, watching them try to contain him with legal obstacles and bureaucratic red tape, watching them use the same tactics that had worked on every other person they had steamrolled over the years. But he wasn't like the others. And now, they knew it. Martinez had spent the past 48 hours filing motions, pushing Denke in front of the right people, forcing the court to acknowledge what was happening. The financial records alone were enough to open a full-scale investigation. But the key had been getting the media involved, not in the way most people did, not with press conferences and grandstanding, but with careful leaks to the right sources. A local journalist, someone who had been covering corruption cases for years, had gotten their hands on enough documentation to start asking questions that couldn't be ignored. By the time Spencer realized what was happening, it was too late. John was sitting in Martinez's office when the call came in. The lawyer answered, putting it on speaker. Spencer's voice was sharp, the carefully measured professionalism she had always carried now edged with something raw. This is a mistake. Martinez leaned back in his chair, expression unreadable. You're going to have to be more specific. You don't know what you're doing. John spoke before Martinez could. Oh, I think we do. A pause. Then, I can make this go away. John exhaled slowly. You already tried that. Spencer's tone dropped. You think you're winning, but you have no idea what you're stepping into. Martinez glanced at John, then back at the phone. That sounds a lot like a threat. Silence. Then, it's a warning. John didn't blink. Then here's mine. Don't stop. You're making a mistake. The call ended. Martinez sat back, folding his hands. She's panicking. John nodded. Good. The next morning, the court issued an emergency injunction, freezing all pending transactions involving properties connected to the scheme. It wasn't the final blow, but it was the beginning of the end. And Spencer knew it. She had spent years operating in the shadows, pulling strings where no one could see, moving money through places that wouldn't raise alarms. But now, the scrutiny was on her, and there was no way out that didn't involve consequences. So she made a move. 2 nights later, John woke to the sound of his phone bratting on the nightstand. He answered without looking at the caller ID. A voice he didn't recognize said, You need to stop. John sat up slowly, his pulse steady. Who is this? A beat of silence. Then, walk away. The line went dead. John stared at the phone for a long moment, then exhaled through his nose. He had been waiting for this. The next day, Martinez received a notice that an anonymous counterclaim had been filed, alleging that John had engaged in fraudulent activity regarding the property. It was a desperate movie, a last-ditch effort to muddy the waters and slow things down. But it wouldn't work, because John had done what they hadn't expected. He had forced them into the open. By the time the court hearing arrived, Spencer was no longer the composed figure she had once been. The Denke was overwhelming financial records, altered documents, testimony from homeowners who had been pushed out under similar circumstances. The judge's ruling was clear: the sale of John's house was nullified, the fraudulent amendment overturned, and a criminal investigation opened into Spencer and her associates. John didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He just exhaled, the weight of the fight settling in his bones. It wasn't over, but it was a start. John stood in the doorway of his house, the house that had been stolen from him, the house they had tried to erase him from. It looked different now, not because of the furniture or the fresh coat of paint someone had slapped on the walls, but because of everything that had happened inside it while he had been gone. He had fought for this place, but standing there now, he wasn't sure if it still felt like home. He stepped inside, the air thick with the scent of something unfamiliar. It wasn't his anymore, not the way it had been before. But that didn't matter. He had won. Nicole Spencer had been arrested earlier that morning. The court's ruling had been swift, and the EVY Denke Martinez had put together had been enough to bury her in legal trouble. She wouldn't be crawling out of it anytime soon. Fraud, conspiracy, falsification of legal documents. There was no walking away from that. She had built her entire career on knowing how to manipulate the system, how to bend rules just enough to avoid breaking them outright. But she had overplayed her hand. The financial records had been the final nail in the coffin. The moment the court froze the assets connected to the fraudulent sales, the people backing her had started pulling out. The lawyers she had on standby had stopped returning her calls. And in the end, when the police had shown up at her door, there had been no one left to shield her. John had watched the news that morning, a footage of her being led out of a government building in handcuffs playing in the background as he drank his coffee. He had thought he'd feel something, satisfaction, relief, maybe even vindication. But all he had felt was a quiet certainty. It was over. The other properties that had been stolen under the same scheme were being revalued. The sales reversed where possible. Some of the former owners had already moved on, unwilling to reopen old wounds. But for the ones who wanted to fight, there was finally a path forward. Martinez had assured him that the case was setting a precedent, one that would make it harder for these kinds of frauds to slip through the cracks in the future. That was good enough for John. He walked through the house slowly, letting his fingers trail along the edges of the kitchen counters, the backs of chairs that weren't his. Some of his things had been recovered, but most of it was gone, replaced, resold, discarded. It didn't bother him as much as he thought it would. Things could be replaced. What mattered was that the space was his again. He stopped in front of the window, looking out over the street. It was quiet now, no more unfamiliar cars parked along the curb, no more meetings happening behind closed doors. The storm had passed, leaving behind nothing but the remnants of a battle that had taken months to win. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. Martinez. Everything settled? John asked as he answered. Just about, Martinez said. I spoke to the court this morning. The last of the paperwork is being finalized. You'll have full ownership restored by the end of the week. John nodded. And Spencer? Not getting out anytime soon. There was a pause. They're digging deeper now? Turns out, she wasn't just running this scam here. There's a whole network of these kinds of cases across different states. Might turn into something bigger. John exhaled. Good. Martinez hesitated. And you? What now? John looked around the HOA, the walls that had once been a refuge and had briefly become a battlefield. He thought about the fight, about everything it had taken to get here, and about the simple truth that had settled in his bones the moment he had stepped back inside. I stay, he said. It's mine. Martinez chuckled. Damn right it is. John ended the call and slid his phone back into his pocket. Then he locked the door. For the first time in a long time, he was home. John spent the next few weeks slowly reclaiming his house. He replaced the furniture, repainted the walls, and removed every trace of the people who had tried to take it from him. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the weight of everything that had happened threatened to overwhelm him. But he had fought too hard to let it break him now. He also started reaching out to the other homeowners who had been affected by Spencer's scheme. Some were hesitant to talk, still reeling from their own battles. But others were eager to share their stories, to find some measure of justice in the wake of everything that had happened. Together, they formed a small but determined group, a coalition of people who had been wronged but refused to be silenced. They met regularly, sharing information, offering support, and working with Martinez to ensure that the legal system didn't forget what had been done to them. It wasn't just about the houses anymore. It was about accountability, about making sure that no one else would have to go through what they had. And as the weeks turned into months, John began to see the impact of their efforts. New laws were proposed, stricter regulations were put in place, and the public's awareness of these kinds of scams grew. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. And for John, that was enough. As he stood on his porch one evening, Watching the sun set over the quiet street, he felt a sense of peace that had been missing for a long time. The house was his again, but more importantly, so was his life. He had fought for it, and he had won. And as he turned to go inside, he knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them with the same determination that had brought him this far. Because he wasn't just a soldier anymore, was a man who had fought for what was his, and he wasn't about to stop now. If you were the one in this story, how would you react? Would you stand up and fight back, or accept the unreasonable pressure and control from the HOA? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video with more people. Your small action gives us the motivation to keep bringing you more intense and engaging stories. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.